When children grow up, they never say, one day I hope I'm going to be homeless.
Tonight, a plan to clear out a Montreal homeless camp is called off.
Ceinture péché, oh mon Dieu, c'est mon trésor, ça.
A Manitoba Métis group works hard to preserve their culture.
Good evening, Tonse, and welcome to APTN National News. I'm Daryl Stranger.
And Daryl Stranger joins me full-time as host of APTN National News and In Focus. Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News. In the Northwest Territories, people often can't find or afford a home. And if they do have a home, they can't get help with repairs. Everything from income thresholds to a lack of insurance can cause houses to go unfixed for years. Our reporter Charlotte Moore Jacobs brings you this story.
Every winter when old pipes freeze, Mildred Lockhart has to empty up to 16 buckets of raw sewage a day from her home. The house belongs to her elderly dad in Little Cay, but he's in Yellowknife for medical reasons.
I would have to have a bucket and bale my sewage and probably have to leave it outside. We usually just use honey buckets and take showers at friends until it warms up. But yeah, that's been a big struggle since I've been here at my dad's place.
She says because her dad does not meet the income requirement from Housing NWT support, she has nowhere to turn. Since March 2021, Housing NWT, formerly known as NWT Housing Corporation, has been reviewing delivery of programs. President and CEO of Housing NWT, Eleanor Young, says changes to policy and practices are slowly addressing significant problems.
There are, of course, legal reasons why it may need to be the homeowner that is involved, and you know, how can we facilitate having that person be part of the application process so that we can still do it and get the work done, even if they may physically be for medical reasons living somewhere else while they're being looked after.
Wanda Grasset in Fort Simpson had a fire last year. Her son has been living here with a single propane heater through the cold winter.
My husband did go to housing, and they told him that they can't help us because we need insurance first. It is really frustrating that we have no help from housing. Like, we don't know where else to turn.
She says she was denied help because she didn't have insurance. Problem is, no one in the neighborhood can get insurance as the area lacks infrastructure like fire hydrants. Housing NWT says their strategy review shows a communication breakdown for some local housing authorities who don't know some policies have been updated and changed, including repair programs, which since 2021 don't require clients to have insurance.
Prior to 2021, we actually required proof of insurance for individuals to access some of our repair programs, and it was absolutely a barrier. And so in 2021, that and owning the land were two things that we removed as eligibility criteria to get access to our programs.
Charlotte Moore Jacobs, APTN National News, Yellowknife.
The homeless community in Montreal is breathing a sigh of relief this morning after the provincial government called off a plan to evict residents of a homeless camp under a main highway overpass. But as Lindsay Richardson reports, with winter coming, that relief may be short-lived.
In the shadow of the Ville-Marie Expressway, out of sight of morning commuters, the residents of the so-called Atwater encampment are waking up undisturbed. Provincial police were expected to move in and dismantle the camp early this morning.
The reason that's been given is construction. Obviously, you can see behind us there is construction. But I think construction is something of a convenient reason to, execute a not in my backyard principle, which is very alive and well.
But on the eve of the dismantling, the plan was postponed, thanks in part to community pushback.
This is the time to share and also put your demands. What are we expecting from this, pause on the eviction? What is their next step? Because the original plan was to evict everyone and to have a group of social workers come and ask them how they're feeling about it, right? The thing is that everybody knows where the resources are. Everyone is very much aware where they could potentially go. The problem is they're either not accepted or there's no room. So unless you have something tangible, this is just a Band-Aid.
A 2018 survey found some 3,100 people in Montreal were homeless. With COVID and a rental crisis on the books, intervention workers feel the situation today is likely worse. But attitudes towards the homeless haven't changed.
When children grow up, they never say, one day I hope I'm going to be homeless. Like, it's nobody's dream. They have to have lived an enormous amount of trauma. And especially for Indigenous people, we have a history of being displaced.
At least 2 members of Montreal's urban Indigenous community died of exposure between 2021 and 2022. And with winter coming, the lack of affordable or livable housing is a problem being raised once again.
If in the meantime you found your own solution in a tent, you shouldn't be penalized for that.
Lucy Partridge said she's been waiting on housing for a year and a half, but didn't want to speak to APTN on camera. Kathleen Wilson's been waiting for 5 years, but says shelters aren't always the solution.
I'm not a baby no more. I'm 61 years old. So why should I go to a friggin' shelter when I can live in a tent and go do what I want to do?
Quebec's Transport Ministry told APTN News they'll work with community groups and the province's Social Services Ministry to relocate those at the Atwater encampment. But they still face eviction, though no new date has been set. Lindsay Richardson, APTN National News, Montreal.
For many who attended residential schools, the trauma is still evident. APTN's Tina House recently caught up with a survivor who says forgiveness was his key in setting himself free. And a warning, some of the details in this next story may be disturbing to some viewers.
For 61-year-old Simple Jan, this walk through Stanley Park holds a lot of significance.
It's been a long time since I was down these trails.
We joined him as he took a walk through this place that he once called home.
When I lived here, I lived with my brother-in-law, and we're both doing whatever. He was doing crack cocaine, I was doing crystal meth, but we lived at the same camp for a number of years. But I felt so lost, absolutely lost. I didn't know where my life was going to go.
He says it was after his wife passed away and he had unresolved trauma is when he turned to drugs. And just down the trail, above Siwash Rock, surrounded by cedar trees and birds singing, is where Simple Jan, whose English name is Stuart Gonzalez, showed us where he lived during that difficult chapter of his life.
Here's the trail. We would go up. We'd go up there, and then our campsite was on that side. We had 2 tents, camouflage tents, and we leveled everything off. We buried our cooler because when we weren't doing substances, we needed to eat. So we were quite resourceful.
Although it's overgrown now, we walked in as far as we could.
After all these years, Stuart, how does it feel to come back here again?
Today I come here and wow is all I can say, because I was in such a dark place, and I've done my own personal healing and personal journey to get to where I am today, and I'm grateful.
But this isn't where his story begins. It goes back to his childhood, when he was just 7 years old and taken to residential school in Sechelt, BC, along with his brother, after their mother became ill.
After that, it was just a nightmare, absolute nightmare. I remember that lunchtime wasn't the greatest of food. The soup was brown water, the meat was green, the potatoes were black, the carrots were gray, and the bread wasn't really healthy. Breakfast was mush. For those who don't know what mush is, it's oatmeal A lot of the mush that we had maggots in it, and so we would be forced to eat the mush. We didn't eat, we starved.
And then he says it got worse after they arrived.
The brothers would take us at night, right, and sexually abuse us. So, you know, it was, I always remember it was a daily event where the brothers would take one of us.
Their mother passed away after that, and it was the community that took him and his brother in after residential school. Today, Simple Jan has been clean and sober since April of 2007. It's taken him years of going to treatment and going to the Choices program. He is now an elected member of the Squamish Nation and a strong leader of his community. Simple Jan is also the proud father of 3, grandfather of 11, and great-grandfather of 13. He says his culture saved his life, and what he's been through has made him stronger. And he's finally at a place in his life that he's forgiven those that abused him.
I needed to forgive them to set me free so they no longer live rent-free in my head. I can honestly say I'm at peace. You know, when I met the Pope and I spoke with the Pope, it brought my healing journey to a new level.
Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
Quite a story. The National Indian Residential School Crisis Line is available for survivors and others who might need support. That number is 1-866-925-4419. Time to step aside for a quick break. Still to come, a Métis organization in Manitoba is working hard to preserve the French language.
Peinture fléchée, oh mon Dieu, c'est mon trésor ça.
Welcome back. While most First Nations in the Yukon are able to consent or not consent to oil and gas development on their territory, a small handful of First Nations are not afforded the same privilege because they don't have final self-government agreements. The NDP has been pushing to reinstate a law that would bring that ability back. Here's Sarah Connors with more.
There are 14 First Nations in the Yukon. 11 of those First Nations have final agreements and are self-governing. 10 years ago, the Yukon government removed Clause 13.1 from the Yukon Oil and Gas Act, which impacts the 3 other First Nations without final agreements. That clause required the government to get consent from Yukon First Nations without a self-government agreement before issuing oil and gas dispositions in their traditional territory.
10 years ago, we weren't having the conversation in the same way about First Nations consent.
Kate White is the leader of the Yukon NDP. She says the Yukon government revoked the clause because 2 of the 3 First Nations without final agreements wouldn't consent to oil and gas development. Last month, her party introduced a bill in the legislature to bring back the consent clause for the First Nations without final agreements. She says one of the main reasons her party is bringing the bill forward is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which enshrines free, prior, and informed consent.
When this clause got removed, it was a really big deal. It's still a really big deal.
So where we're coming from is in a position where we should have a say what happens out there in our sacred territory.
The NDP has also received letters of support from Yukon First Nations, like the Ross River Dene Council. It's one of the First Nations without a final agreement and is directly impacted by the consent clause. Chief Dylan Loblaw says both the Liberal and Yukon Party governments have walked away from prior agreements that ensured Ross River the right to consent.
The broken commitments continue to carry on to this modern day.
Despite the support of many Yukon First Nations with and without agreements, on Wednesday, the Yukon Party and Liberal government unanimously voted against the bill. Premier Sandy Silver said in a statement to APTN, while the government agrees with the intent of the bill, in the absence of thorough consultation with Yukon First Nations and Transboundary First Nations, we are unable as a government to support these amendments to the Oil and Gas Act at this time. Chief Loblaw says he's disappointed in the vote and that it's another example of the government failing his First Nation.
So there's a lack of communication, and there is no meaningful consultation for that government to get that information.
And I think that's
White says there's likely no future for the bill in its current form.
And I don't think any of these conversations are going to be easy. I don't think any of these actions are going to be easy, but I know they're really important and they have to happen.
Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
The St. Joseph Métis Union in Manitoba has been bringing French-speaking Métis together since the death of Louis Riel. This cultural organization seeks to preserve the French language and Métis culture, but as Amelia Fournier shows us, it is also evolving with the times.
Voltei se prenda, vou te bec de crème, viens donc m'embrasser, oh mon beau petit bec sucré.
Georges Baudry is singing in French, not just because it's his first language, but in some ways, it's still an act of defiance. He's a proud francophone Métis and active in his community of Saint-Malo, Manitoba.
C'est la façon que moi j'ai été élevé, dans le bois, avec la chasse, la pêche, les amis, la musique, tu sais, comme ils disent en anglais, work hard, play hard. C'était ça essentiellement notre credo, quoi.
Baudry has been a member of l'Union Nationale Métis de Saint-Joseph du Manitoba for decades. L'Union Nationale gathers Francophone Red River Métis in Manitoba for cultural activities like intergenerational camps and beading workshops.
Ma ceinture fléchée, oh mon Dieu, c'est mon trésor, ça.
The union's president, Paulette Duguay, says it's important to preserve the language Métis spoke historically.
Sa mission a toujours été d'affirmer, de protéger, de promouvoir, premièrement, la culture métisse, les droits des métis et aussi la langue française, parce que c'est la langue de nos anciens. Ça, puis le Métis.
Michif is a language spoken by Métis that blends indigenous languages with French and English. But over the course of the 20th century, many Métis lost their French.
Il y avait tellement de discrimination et de souffrance à admettre que tu étais métisse que les gens ont commencé à ne pas parler français parce qu'ils voyaient que ça serait peut-être plus facile d'être accepté, de s'assimiler dans le monde anglophone ici au Manitoba.
But Duguay says that now, in the era of reconciliation, people can benefit by calling themselves Métis.
Avec le phénomène récent de l'appropriation culturelle, aujourd'hui, nous sommes dans l'obligation de vraiment étudier notre Constitution et apporter des changements parce qu'elle ne reflète pas l'actualité.
Indigenous identity verification is not part of the registration process to the Union, which has existed since 1887. In past decades, it wasn't necessary.
C'était communautaire, on se connaissait. Oh ben oui, métis. Il n'y avait pas cette frontière-là ou cette barrière-là d'avoir à montrer preuve. Les familles se connaissaient.
While some are trying to falsely pass themselves off as Métis, Duguay says many older Métis still feel shame and hurt associated with their Métis identity.
Le but aussi de l'Union, c'est d'essayer de rehausser, de dire à ces gens-là, surtout les gens d'un certain âge, que c'est correct. Aujourd'hui, c'est correct. Vous pouvez terminer votre vie sachant que c'est correct d'être métis, puis pour une fois de votre vie, soyez-en fiers.
Baudry said francophone Métis are an essential part of Métis culture.
Nous sommes le cœur, je crois. Nous sommes le cœur des métis. Parce qu'on croit encore dans le fait qu'on est francophone. On est très fiers de ça. J'aime la bouteille aussi. Savez-vous comment?
Emilia Fournier, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
The video makes you want to sit around by the river and play some music. Nation to Nation is coming up right after the news, and we've got a preview for you on the other side of the break. Stick around. Welcome back. Time now for our photo of the day. Here's a great shot of a totem pole that's standing tall in Winnipeg's Assiniboine Park. Our thanks to Jared Delorme for sending that in. If you want to be featured as our photo of the day, you can email your shots to share@aptn.ca along with the description and location. Now let's take a look at Friday's weather forecast. Starting on the East Coast, 18 for Halifax and Fredericton. Minus 13 in Kuujjuaq, 6 below in Nain. 18 with showers in Montreal, minus 1 with snow in Chibougamau. 11 with showers in Sault Ste. Marie, 15 with rain in North Bay. 0 with flurries in Thunder Bay, minus 4 in Sioux Lookout with snow. Minus 14 in Churchill, 9 below in God's Lake and Norway House. Minus 5 with snow in Winnipeg, 8 below and snow in Dauphin. Minus 14 for Regina, 18 below in Saskatoon. 11 below with snow in La Ronge and Uranium City. In northern Alberta, sun's out and 17 below for high level, minus 15 and sunny in Grand Prairie. Minus 10 in Edmonton, sunny and 9 below in Lethbridge. Plus 6 with snow in Vancouver, 7 with rain in Victoria. Minus 8 with snow in Prince George, 10 below in Dease Lake. Minus 11 in Old Crow, 7 below with snow in Whitehorse. Minus 6 and flurries in Yellowknife, 10 below and snow in Norman Wells. Minus 8 with snow in Sax Harbor, snow and minus 5 in Paulatuck. Minus 17 in Chesterfield, 23 below for Baker Lake. Minus 19 and snow in Resolute, 16 below with snow in Igloolik. It's Thursday, and that means our political current affairs show, Nation to Nation, will be airing right here after the break. Here's host Fraser Needham with a look ahead.
On tonight's episode of Nation to Nation, we'll be having a closer look at Indigenous veterans' relationship to Remembrance Day. Assembly of First Nations National Chief Roseanne Archibald says it's important all Canadians recognize the significance of Indigenous Veterans Day. Military historian John Moses talks about the long and often complex history Indigenous people have had with Canada's armed forces. And Indigenous veterans advocate John Jewett says a career in the military is something young Indigenous people should seriously explore. We'll have all this and more coming up in a few minutes.
Thanks, Fraser. And some congratulatory news to end with here tonight for our own Daryl Stranger, as he moves into a host role here at APTN National News. He'll also be the host of In Focus.
Tansei, good evening and welcome to APTN National News. I'm Daryl Stranger.
Certainly a familiar face, Daryl joined APTN in 2018 as an intern and left briefly for a stint as a reporter in British Columbia. He came back to be our Winnipeg reporter and acted as fill-in host. He will now be replacing Melissa Ridgen on air full-time. Welcome, Daryl. Huge congrats, and that's a great way to end this Thursday newscast. For much more on anything you've seen here, you can visit our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for being with us. Stick around. Nation to Nation's up next. Have a great night.